Hello YouTube, Dave here again. Today I am answering another viewer question. This is actually a pretty old one that it's sort of taken me a while to figure out exactly how I want to answer this. But the question is, how do I personally rank the different editions of the Dungeons & Dragons game? And lists can always be very contentious, and I understand that, and I recognize that, and I've done some ranking things in the past. And it's always been one of those situations where people will take my personal rankings or opinions as me saying this is the way everyone should think. I've had some people get very defensive or very inflammatory, actually, towards me when I've discussed like my own personal preferences. And I've always made it pretty clear that it was based off just my own personal decisions, my own personal likes and dislikes, and that I never expect my rankings to be what's considered definitive. I never expect, how I put things to be the way that everyone else should also do it. So the one thing I will say in this video is it's absolutely totally fine for you to share your own personal rankings or list of how you would rate the various editions from your least favorite to your most favorite, but just do so in a respectful manner. I'm honestly kind of getting sick of how negative in general the internet can be and how quick to anger people can be over what's ultimately something that's just kind of it's a fun, silly list, and that's really all that this is. So feel free to share again your opinions, your rankings, however you want to do it. But again, just be respectful about it, because if you're going to be insulting, rude, or ignorant, then your comments are not going to be staying on my videos, because I'm just sick of how negative the internet can get in general. It's one of the things that actually pushed me towards taking a pretty lengthy break, because I just couldn't. I was getting sick of handling it or having to deal with it. So just be respectful, and this is meant to be a fun thing. The channel is meant to be about fun discussions, so let's just keep it that way, okay? So with that said, I will be ranking the editions in my own personal preference, from the one that I'm least interested in to the one that I want to run the most. And I am basing it off of my desire to run these rule sets for what I would consider to be like a campaign, which would be, a year to a year and a half or 2 years worth of regular gameplay, be it weekly, bi-weekly, or even monthly. Like how much time do I want to spend running these rule sets? And to a certain extent, it's also how much do I think others in my group would want to play these rule sets. So I'm not basing these off of necessarily how good I think the rules are designed or anything like that. It's how much fun I think I would have running it. So again, just keep that in mind. I'm someone who DMs like 100% of the time. In the last 20 years, I would say the amount of time I've spent DMing versus playing is probably like 80-20. And of the last for the last 15 of those 20 years, it's probably been like 95-5. So this is how I'm basing it. It's my desire to run the campaign, or run the rule sets. Also, I was originally planning on breaking out multiple versions of the same basic rule set. In terms of like things like 3rd and 3.5, 4th edition and essentials, and things like that. But ultimately, as I was looking at it, it didn't really make a difference overall. It just made it so that I could have like 10 items instead of 7. But really, they always ended up winding up next to each other anyway. So there was honestly no point in doing that. So I will be looking at things like 0 edition, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition, as well as the D&D basic rule set. So those will be the 7 items that I will be putting in my personal preference order for how much I want to run these as a long-term game. As a player, I would jump into any one of these games in an instant if I had the ability to do so. I've been invited to a couple of online games, but just the timing just never really worked out due to time zone differences or things going on with our family at the time. But if someone in my local area was running any of these editions, even the one that I rank at the very bottom, and they said, do you want to play? I would absolutely jump at the opportunity. So again, as I'm not saying that any of these are bad, every single one of these rule sets I think has some great stuff to offer, and there's going to be hours, if not years, and maybe even decades of fun ahead of anyone who chooses any of these rule sets. So none of them are bad. They all have their strengths, they all have their weaknesses, but they're all totally valid to play. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and begin. So coming in at number 7, the rule set that I'm the least interested in running at this point in time, and this might make some people upset. Again, be respectful in the comments. I'm looking at D&D 3rd edition, 3.0 and 3.5. The basic reason why I put this at the very bottom of my list is simply the fact that between these two versions of the game, I ran regular weekly games for the better part of 12 years. And I just kind of got burnt out on the system. It was a great system for the time, and I know that a lot of people still love, particularly 3.5, they still particularly love that today. For those who are sort of unaware, this is the rulebook for 3.0. This is the rulebook for 3.5. It does say 3.5 right here, but I do have an overhead light, so I don't know if the glare is making that hard to see. I can't read it through the viewfinder on the camera. But again, both these systems are, very well done for the most part. I mean, 3.0 obviously had enough issues that they felt the need to revise it. But it was sort of the turning point, and it's the first version of what we know as modern Dungeons & Dragons today. It was the first edition to have your armor class ascend rather than descend, and it just sort of had the more logical version of, rolling a number, adding a bonus, and trying to equal or exceed a number, rather than trying to get below a target number or subtracting things to lower your defense and then still trying to roll. It was a system that I think made it a lot easier for beginners to get into, and that was the best thing about 3rd edition, is that it really brought in a whole bunch of new players because the mechanics were logical. I know people love earlier versions of the game, but to be fair, 3rd edition I think really streamlined and simplified. It actually took a little bit more after things like the D&D basic rule set than it actually did the advanced versions of the game that came before it. And again, I ran these rules combined between the two books for about 12 years. From 2000 until about 2012 is when I wrapped up my final 3.5 campaign. The reason I don't want to run it beyond that is just there were certain aspects of the rules that I got really tired of, and that I felt like I had to do things to sort of work around. Things like spell resistance and damage reduction, especially in 3.5, just got really out of hand. At first, I liked the idea of damage reduction based off of weapon properties, mainly because in 3.0 you had like a silvered weapon, but there was no point in ever having one because a magic weapon automatically trumped it. So, and you can get magic items, especially weapons, relatively early in your progression in 3rd edition. So by the time you are fighting enemies that required a silver weapon, you probably already had a +1 weapon anyway. There was also issues with multiclassing in 3rd edition and 3.5 that became tiring in the way that people would do it to sort of cherry pick and min-max, and it just felt like it sort of ushered in a whole new era of like power gaming, which for people that enjoy it, that's fine. If you're the kind of person who does it and does it without trying to disrupt the game or beat the dungeon master, then I have no issues with that. I didn't have those kind of players, unfortunately, in my experiences. So the ones who wanted to cherry pick abilities did it because they wanted to break the game, not just have more fun themselves playing it. And that's sort of the big difference. And I saw that get abused quite a bit. So for me, 3.0 and 3.5 is something that I would play, but I will probably never run it again. So at number 6, we have Original Dungeons & Dragons. And this is, again, probably going to upset a few people, but please hear me out. The reason that I put this at the second to last in my desire to run is sort of the exact opposite reason of why 3rd edition was there. With 3rd edition, I ran it to death, But with Zero Edition, I just have no experience with this rule set, so it's something that I would have to completely learn from scratch. I've never played it, I've never run it. No one that I was gaming with at the time was running it, so again, I have very little familiarity with it. I know that Zero Edition is really big in the OSR community, and a lot of retro clones or, new rule sets sort of based off of old ideas borrows very heavily from the original Dungeons and Dragons, and that's great. But again, I just don't really think it would be worth my time to learn this whole new version of the game, or I guess in this case, the really, really original old version of the game. For the purposes of trying to get a game together, I don't think there would be a lot of interest within my gaming group to play this particular version. So that also is a major part in this decision. I don't think I'd want to be carrying these books around with me since I run most of my games in a public place. So that's another big reason why this is as low as it is on this particular list. Other things that just kind of got to me was when I was looking through the Men in Magic book and saw that, it was expected that a single referee could have a table of up to 20 players. And I know this is based off of a different type of rule set, and this is more like the wargaming stuff. And being the referee may not be the exact same thing as being a modern dungeon master, but when I just see those numbers, it just kind of gave me bad flashbacks of running large groups in more modern D&D, and it's just not something that I'm necessarily interested in. Let's say it's not a knock against the version of the game itself, it's just I have zero personal history with this version of the game, either as a game master or as a player, and I don't want to take these books out into public with me, and I don't think there's going to be an interest for my players to go this far back. So it's, again, a really important version of the game. In fact, without this, none of the other ones would exist, so I'm not downplaying its importance. It's just, for me, I don't think it would be worth the time it would take to get comfortable with the rule set for the limited amount of interest that I think I would have personally in my area. Coming in at number 5, we have Advanced Dungeons & Dragons First Edition. And this was kind of a tough one to place. The fact of the matter is that up until the release of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, I'd spent the better part of a year running a First Edition AD&D game, and I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. I liked the rule set. So why is it as low as it is? Well, the key thing I think here is organization. And truth be told, it was always kind of frustrating trying to find a particular rule or explanation of a rule in any of the between the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide. Chapters weren't really separated all that clearly, and just I don't know, it just didn't flow well in terms of trying to look something up. Oftentimes, I would just have to make a ruling. Because I was tired of flipping through and trying to find things. I mean, there was like an index and stuff like that, but I'm more used to the layouts of later versions of the game, which did a better job of separating everything, so you would have a general idea of where it would be, and it would just be a matter of finding the specific rule. The chart-based version of the combat, which a lot of people love, was fine. But I didn't actually really end up using that. Essentially what I did was I had a character sheet for First Edition that had the chart laid out for attacking from like armor class 10 to like armor class -3 or -5 or something like that. So the players would have their numbers written down, and when I was writing down monster stats, I would find where their to hit armor class 0 number was, and I would just write down like THAC0 and then the number, and then essentially just subtract the player's armor class from the monster's THAC0 to get whatever number I needed or better to hit. So it was enjoyable. There's a lot that I did like about it, but the organization was a bit of a frustrating mess to sort of try to get through. And honestly, as good as it is, the fact of the matter is I think that later editions just did a better job of presenting their information. So I had a lot of fun running it, and I would run this again. Don't get me wrong, But if I were to go back and start in what's considered sort of a retro version of the Dungeons and Dragons game, having already gotten this one out and having spent time running it, I would probably choose Others, obviously, before going back to this, and that's why it is where it is on this list. Alright, coming in at number 4, we have Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition. And this is something that, honestly, when I first was asked this question, which was probably about 3 years ago, this one would have probably been at the bottom, if not like the second from the bottom. And it's not really fair to the rule set. I've already actually made a video apologizing to essentially 2nd Edition AD&D. But basically what had happened was when I first got into the game, I had some rough experiences with it. And mainly my rough experiences came with the way I was introduced to the game, the attitude of the Dungeon Master towards new players or towards beginners was not particularly friendly. And basically I was made to audition for the campaign based off of how well a beginner who had no concept of what a tabletop RPG was performed in a one-on-one combat. And when you're rolling random numbers, it's really easy, even for the most experienced players, to do poorly. So I'm glad that it didn't go bad enough that I wasn't invited into the game, because this hobby has made a huge impact on my life. But it almost could have gone the other way. And for the longest time, I sort of grouped that feeling of like frustration over how I was treated early on with the rule set itself, which wasn't fair. Looking back, 2nd Edition is actually really similar to 1st Edition in a lot of ways. The biggest thing that I liked, though, was the organization. Chapters were clearly broken down, and you didn't have a situation where a chapter might begin partway through a page. Each chapter had its own title page, and it made sense. The combat rules were in the player's handbook. There were versions of the combat rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide as well. In fact, some stuff did overlap between the two books, but it still just was easier to find stuff, and it used the THAC0 system, which, even though it was frustrating early on to deal with it, mainly because nobody was wanting to explain how it worked, or you had different people explaining different ways. In fact, even to this day, in comments, people will come up with different ways of calculating it when the book itself just says subtract your THAC0 number from the opponent's armor class, and then you know what number you need. And that system works really well. But this is an edition that the more I've looked back on it, the more I really liked it. And when I was running 1st Edition, I just couldn't help but think of how much I kind of preferred some things about 2nd Edition. So this is something that if I were to go back and run a version of AD&D, having already run 1st Edition, this is probably the next version that I would want to introduce my group to. And they did take well enough to 1st Edition AD&D that I think that I might be able to get them to try 2nd Edition. So hopefully one of these days I will get a chance to run this game again and run it actually knowing what I'm doing, unlike what I was doing when I first started, which was pretty rough. So it'd be nice to go back and run this with a better understanding of the rules. But that's why it is at number 4 on my list. Alright, coming in at number 3, so we are into the final 3, the top 3 versions of Dungeons & Dragons that I would love to run again, or just love to run in general. We are taking a look at Dungeons & Dragons 4th Edition. Now, 4th Edition is sort of the black sheep of the D&D family. Even more than, say, 2nd Edition AD&D was, which a lot of people tended to skip as well. And went from 1st to 3rd, and I feel like the same thing kind of happened with 3rd into 5th. But 4th Edition is a much better system than I think a lot of people give it credit for. And it's always kind of frustrating to hear people just flat out, bash the system without having ever tried it. And it's also kind of funny to see these same people, which I've seen online. I've seen some people post some really hateful things towards 4th Edition and towards people who play 4th Edition, which is not cool, by the way, to be that kind of person. But I've seen someone say those like really horrible things about the fourth edition game, but then they love fifth edition. And what's interesting is that a lot of the mechanics in fifth edition are ported directly from fourth edition and just renamed. If you like the fact that some, the classes have abilities that you can use and have to take a short rest to regain another use of, well, that's essentially an encounter power from 4th edition. If you like cantrips in 5th edition, well, 4th edition had them as at-will abilities. Things that you have to get a long rest for were essentially daily powers. There's a lot of 4th edition's DNA in 5th edition, and I think a lot of people really should try the 4th edition game and actually try it with an open mind and not just blindly hate it because it's different from what 3rd edition is. Again, if you like 5th, you owe a lot of that to 4th edition. The other great thing about 4th edition is it actually managed to mechanically make the classes function in a similar manner. Some people would claim that that waters the game down, and I can sort of understand where they're coming from. But for me, the thing that I noticed is that players when I ran 4th edition would actually try classes that they didn't normally play. Because they functioned similarly, they felt, like stepping outside of their comfort zone because they were trying something radically different anyway. And I just sort of liked that aspect of it. The classes still functioned like differently in combat systems, like your wizards would still want to hang back and use their magic spells. The rogues would still want to sort of flank and get use of their sneak attack, and you would have like the fighters would still want to be at the front of the battle, taking as much enemy attention as possible. So a lot of it still functioned very, very similarly. Wizards still needed spell books; they still needed to prepare their spells. So it's as different as it sounds. When you start really reading it, you notice that there are similarities between this and earlier editions of the game. Another great thing about 4th edition was that it got rid of multi-classing as 3rd edition had it, and it sort of got rid of prestige classes and instead had like Paragon paths, for example, that you could take for the different classes, which is developed into what we have as archetypes in the current version of the D&D game. And for multi-classing, you would take it as a series of feats, so that you were still your primary class, but you had some basic abilities of the other classes, and it never really felt as overpowered or unbalanced as it could get with earlier editions of the, especially with 3rd edition, the way that the multi-classing worked. I just didn't care for it, but I preferred the way it was done here in 4th edition. The question is, which version of 4th edition do I recommend? And I would probably have to go with, if I had to choose between the hardcover versions and the D&D Essentials books, especially to introduce players to it for the first time, I would go with the Essentials books, which are the ones that you see on the left. They were the pocket books sort of things, soft covers, and they were financially a lot cheaper to pick up overall. And it was a great version of the game because it took the options that you had in the hardcovers, but it made the classes more streamlined and focused on a theme. And you had choices at pretty much every level within that theme, but it still was not as overwhelming to look at character creation or leveling in the D&D Essentials as it was in the 4th edition core rulebooks. But the great thing about the Essentials and the hardcovers is that they actually are designed to work together. So you can play a class from the Essentials book if everyone else is using the hardcovers and still fit in properly. Like unlike 3.5 and 3.0, Essentials didn't necessarily negate or replace what had come before it. It just sort of streamlined, simplified, and built around a theme. So again, I really like 4th edition. I know that a lot of people will hate on it, and I still think that you really should give it a chance, have an open mind, and realize that if 5th edition is your favorite version of the game, you owe a lot of that to this version of the game. So at the very least, just move on. If you really still don't like the game and you're not willing to try it out, just move on, because there's newer stuff out there that you can play and that a lot of people do like, and enjoy. So anyway, fourth edition for me is number 3 on my list of games, editions of Dungeons and Dragons that I would like to run for like a long-term campaign. Coming in at number 2, we have Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition. This is the current version of the D&D game, and honestly, it is a really great version of the rule set. Wizards of the Coast listened to, feedback when it came to the 4th Edition game, and they built upon it, and they released what is one of the strongest editions to date. Having run it for a little over 5 years now, there are some aspects of it that are starting to kind of wear on me a little bit, so it might be losing its shine a little bit to me. But overall, this is still a version of the game that I am running regularly and want to continue to run regularly. Once my current 5th edition campaign wraps up, I plan on immediately going into another one. So this is something that I will be running on a continuous basis. They did bring back the 3rd edition style of multiclassing, which is something that I'm not a huge fan of, and certain abilities feel easier to pull off or easier to get use out of and feel a little bit more overpowered as a result. But that's a topic for another video. The fact of the matter is that this is one of the most solid versions of the rules to be released. It has the sort of class progression style and the mechanics of the classes similar to what we had in 4th edition, but it's a lot less defined as a rule set, meaning that the Dungeon Masters have more influence over how the game is run, how they're running their games. It's a little bit harder, not impossible, but it's a little bit harder for that instance to sort of have arguments over the rules or rules lawyers, which was a big issue with 3rd edition, and was also an aspect of 4th edition that could be somewhat difficult to work with sometimes. But having a more AD&D approach where, the Dungeon Master is supposed to be the authority, I do like that aspect of it. The core rule books, again, are all great. There are a slew of ready-made campaigns and adventures that you can choose from, and I will be revisiting those as well in a future video and sort of reordering how I want to run those in order of least interested to most interested, or the ones that I like the least to the most. But again, this is a fantastic edition, and I suspect that most of you watching this are heavily into playing 5th edition today. It's an excellent version of the game, well worth your time, well worth your money, and I enjoy running it. I might make some house rules for my next game, but this is something that I'm going to immediately pick back up once my current game has ended. So for that reason alone, it had to be at least at the lowest number 2 on my list. But now we get into number 1, and if you've been keeping track, you probably know what this version of D&D is going to be. And finally, at number 1, we have the D&D Basic Expert Rule Set. So this is something that was always a holy grail for me in terms of collecting, and in terms of me wanting to run something that was sort of old school. This was a version of the game that I was always very interested in. A large part of it stemmed from the fact that I simply didn't own it and had very little reference to sort of look into it, but I did play it. A friend of mine was running module B2, Keep on the Borderlands, and I got to make my elf character, and I think we turned a corner and ran into, it was either a Minotaur or an Ogre. I want to say it was Minotaur, and basically the party wiped. But it was a lot of fun, and from that moment I wanted to get more into the basic version of the game. Basic D&D has a very convoluted history, but to sort of make a long story short, you had 3 different versions overall of the basic rule set, not including the PDF basic rules that you can get for D&D 5th edition now. But the original version of the basic rule set was referred to as the Eric Holmes Basic, or Holmes Basic. I think it was also generally referred to as the Blue Box version of D&D Basic. and that version was sort of not meant to necessarily be its own standalone rule set, but it was more meant to tidy up the Zero Edition rule set and let you sort of play that enough to get your feet wet in the Dungeons and Dragons game system before sort of steering you towards First Edition AD&D. So it was sort of a stopgap between Zero Edition and First Edition. However, eventually they decided to release it, sort of revise it, redo it, and it sort of became its own rule set. And that's where you have the Moldvay and Cook version of the D&D basic rules and the D&D expert rules, which you see on the right here. So with these, again, it was actually intended to be its own fully isolated rule set. It wasn't meant to necessarily steer you towards the AD&D game. It was just meant to be its own thing. Originally, the plans, from what I understand, was that there was going to be a basic rule set, the expert rule set, and then there was going to be the companion rules, which was a third expansion to the Moldvay Cook version of the D&D basic rule set, basic expert rules. However, for whatever reason, and the reason escapes me at this point in time, but it just never came to fruition. And instead, Frank Mentzer was tasked with revising and sort of updating the basic rule set. And he released that as a series of 5 different box sets, which is often referred to as Mentzer D&D or the BECME Dungeons & Dragons, which was a box set for basic rules, which is also generally referred to as the Red Box. So if you remember the 4th edition D&D Essentials box with the Red Dragon and the Warrior on it, that was the same cover that was on the box of the Mentzer version of the basic rule set. Then there was the expert rules. Finally, the companion rules were released along with the master rules, and then finally sort of the epic levels of that version of the D&D game, the Immortals rule set. Overall, I think the basic expert rules are very similar between all 3 versions, especially the basic rules. I think are fairly similar between the 3. And if I had to choose, I would go with what ended up being a compilation of the Mentzer versions, the D&D Rules Cyclopedia. The Rules Cyclopedia gathers information from the basic, expert, companion, and master rule set, and then sort of touches briefly on the immortal rules, but not enough that you could actually play an immortal character. They did re-release the Wrath of the Immortals box set, which is meant to replace the original immortal rule set, but I'm not interested in that anyway, because epic levels traditionally have been kind of problematic, and this version of the game can already support up to level 36, so I don't think we necessarily need to go beyond that, or the amount of time it would take to go beyond that, I think would be, pretty impressive. But overall, this is just a version of the game that I really want to run. It's a version of the game that I would love to start a campaign up. The only thing that's stopping me from doing that now is the fact that I'm currently already running 4 regular games. So adding a 5th on there is just going to be, I think, a little bit too much. But it's something that I could see replacing maybe a game of, with this, or even just running this sort of in between. So if I finish up, say, like a Starfinder campaign, then I might, open this up for a few months and then get into another Starfinder game. But this is a system that I'm really, really interested in. I loved playing it. I just loved the classes, and even like even though the fact that the races were essentially their own class. There was just something about this rule system that I kind of fell in love with, and I really want to get an opportunity to run this again someday. Well, not again, but run this someday, because I think it's a really, really great system, and I don't think you're going to go wrong with either of the 2 major versions, which would be the Mentzer D&D or the Moldvay Cook basic expert rules. I think either way you're going to have a great time, and I'm looking forward to finally getting an opportunity to run this. It's the system that I most want to run, but the thing that's kind of holding me back again is how much of an interest am I going to get in this, and how much are the players going to want to continue with this style of game over like the more modern, newer versions of the Dungeons & Dragons game. I could also mention the Basic Fantasy booklet as well, because it's essentially this version of the Dungeons & Dragons game, just modernized with D20 rules. And that would probably be the ultimate version to run, I think, for people to be familiar with the rule set. But I want to go with the with the authentic version personally. So that is my personal rankings for the different editions. So just to recap, at number 7 was D&D 3rd edition and 3.5. At number 6 was original Dungeons & Dragons. At number 5 was the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition. Number 4 was AD&D 2nd edition. At number 3 we had 4th edition. Number 2 we have our current 5th edition rule set. And at number 1 we have the Rule Cyclopedia, or the D&D Basic Expert Rules. So let me know in the comments below, how would you personally rank the different versions of the Dungeons & Dragons game? What's the one that you're most interested in, either as a player or as a dungeon master? Which one are you the most interested in? Well, how do the different editions fall in between? And again, I have to stress, it's a personal opinion. This whole video was my opinion. And it's okay to have a different opinion, but it's not okay to become hostile or belligerent because of a difference of opinion. So just keep it respectful, keep it classy, and remember that this is supposed to be a channel where we talk about things that we enjoy. It's meant to be fun. It's meant to be fun for everyone, and it's not meant to be a place to try to, make other people feel bad for not sharing your opinions. So let me know what yours are in the comments below, but just, again, keep it classy. Anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Take care.